The wind howls through the crumbling remains of an old homestead, its wooden beams long splintered by time. The air is thick with dust, swirling through broken doorways and shattered windows like ghosts whispering forgotten names. These ruins, once brimming with life, now stand as eerie monuments to a past that history seldom acknowledges. Once, children played in these courtyards, their laughter ringing against the vast African plains. Now, silence reigns. This was once a Boer settlement, built with hope, defended with blood, and ultimately abandoned to the relentless passage of time. The stories of the people who built these homes are etched in every weathered stone, in the rusted iron of discarded tools, and in the barren fields where crops once stood tall. The story of these forgotten towns begins in the early 19th century, when the Great Trek saw thousands of Afrikaners leave British-controlled Cape Colony in search of freedom. The British, having abolished slavery and imposed laws that weakened Afrikaner autonomy, had become unwelcome rulers. Refusing to bow to foreign rule, the Boers gathered their families, their livestock, and all they could carry, setting out into the untamed wilderness. Their ox wagons, burdened with provisions and the weight of their uncertain future, creaked beneath the pressure of the journey. They trudged forward, undeterred by the unrelenting sun, the torrential rains, and the vast, seemingly endless landscape stretching before them. They sought not only land but also a sanctuary, a place where they could build a world governed by their own laws, rooted in their faith, and free from outside influence. But the land they claimed was not empty. It was already home to powerful African kingdoms, including the Zulu, the Ndebele, and the Xhosa, who had lived and thrived on these lands for centuries. To the indigenous people, the Boer settlers were not pioneers but intruders, foreigners laying claim to a land that was never theirs to take. Clashes erupted almost immediately. The settlers built loggers' circle formations of wagons used as makeshift fortresses whenever they camped, fearing sudden attacks. The walls of these now abandoned towns once echoed with the sound of gunfire, the cries of battle, and the prayers of those who believed they were chosen by God to tame this land. Every river crossing carried the risk of an ambush. Every stretch of open veldt was a battlefield waiting to be claimed. The Boers fought with muskets and determination, but the land fought back with hunger, disease, and the relentless resistance of those who refused to be displaced. And yet, they endured. Those who survived the journey laid the foundations of settlements, small, self-sufficient towns where whitewashed churches stood at the heart of their communities. The land was plowed, homes were built from stone and mud bricks, and walls rose to protect against the ever-present dangers of the wild, but survival came at a cost. Every acre of land seized was a chapter written in blood. Entire villages were erased, both Boer and African alike, in the struggle for dominance. The settlers built, they fought, and they prayed, believing their sacrifices would secure a future for their children. But the world was changing, and the land they had fought so hard to claim would one day reclaim them. The same winds that carried their prayers now carry only dust, sweeping through the ruins of their forgotten dreams. The Boer settlements, once nothing more than crude outposts in an unforgiving wilderness, grew into thriving communities. Their towns were built on sheer perseverance, their structures hewn from the land itself, churches and town halls fashioned from sandstone, their foundations laid with the sweat of pioneers who had tamed the earth with their bare hands. Pretoria, Bloemfontein, and Potchefstroom rose as strongholds of Afrikaner identity, bustling with trade, culture, and governance. But beyond these well-known cities lay the hidden settlements, the small, forgotten towns nestled in the valleys and along the rivers, places where Boers sought not only survival but refuge, away from the ever-looming threats of British control and the relentless Zulu forces. These towns were lifelines, bastions of self-sufficiency where cattle grazed in vast pastures, families gathered around fires to share tales of their ancestors, and prayers were whispered in the echoing halls of their modest churches. These were not just towns, they were fortresses of Afrikaner identity, isolated enclaves where history was kept alive through stories passed from one generation to the next. Here, the past was sacred, the guiding force that shaped their way of life. They told of ancestors who had defied British rule, of the blood spilled on battlefields to protect their land, and of the suffering endured in the endless struggles against disease, hunger, and war. Theirs was a history forged in hardship, and in these settlements, that history was carefully preserved. Yet, despite their resilience, the shadow of uncertainty loomed over them. The outside world was changing, and the forces that had once driven them to carve out a new life in the wilderness were shifting in ways they could neither predict nor control. The spirit of independence that defined these towns would soon be tested in ways that would shake their very foundations. The discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand and diamonds in the Orange Free State turned South Africa into a battleground for European imperialism. Almost overnight, the lands that had once been frontier settlements became some of the most valuable territories on earth. The British, unwilling to allow Boer independence to interfere with their economic ambitions, intensified their efforts to bring the Afrikaners under their rule. The Anglo-Boer War erupted, a brutal conflict that saw the British deploy devastating scorched earth tactics. Entire towns were razed, homes and farmlands set ablaze, livestock slaughtered, leaving only charred remains where thriving communities had once stood. Boer families were rounded up and forced into concentration camps, where disease and starvation claimed the lives of thousands. For many, there was no return, only the silent memory of what once was, a past reduced to ash. Today, the remains of these settlements lie scattered across South Africa, their faded foundations whispering of lives once lived in defiance of an empire. Some ruins still stand, their skeletal frames a haunting reminder of an era long past. The roads that once carried wagons filled with hopeful settlers are now overgrown, their paths obscured by time. The sandstone churches, once filled with voices raised in hymn, now stand empty, their walls crumbling beneath the weight of forgotten prayers. And yet, in the minds of those who still remember, the stories endure. The legacy of these towns, built with sweat and defended with blood, lingers in the land itself, a silent testament to a people who once believed they could carve their own destiny from stone. The 20th century ushered in a new era, one that gradually unraveled the fabric of many Boer towns. The rise of the National Party in 1948 brought Afrikaner nationalism to its peak, solidifying their political power and reinforcing a deep sense of identity among their people. Yet, paradoxically, it also accelerated the erosion of the rural settlements that had once been the bedrock of their heritage. Economic opportunities lay elsewhere in the booming cities of Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. Young men, who once would have inherited their fathers' farms, instead left in search of work in the expanding industrial sectors. Families followed, drawn by the promise of a more stable livelihood. The once thriving settlements emptied out, their marketplaces deserted, their fields left untended. As the younger generations turned their backs on the past, the heart of these towns began to wither, beating slower with each passing year. Then came the political shifts. Apartheid, the rigid system designed to uphold Afrikaner dominance, became a double-edged sword. While it sought to preserve the old order, it also deepened South Africa's isolation from the world. International sanctions tightened around the country, economies faltered, and the rigid grip of the National Party weakened under the weight of internal resistance. Change was inevitable. The fall of apartheid in the 1990s marked the dawn of a new South Africa, one where racial segregation was dismantled and a new political landscape took shape. Many Boer settlements, once protected by their isolation, found themselves obsolete in this shifting tide. Without government backing and with no new generations to sustain them, these towns fell into disrepair, becoming relics of a bygone era. Land reform policies, aimed at redistributing property to correct historical injustices, further sealed the fate of these settlements. Farms that had remained in Boer families for generations were abandoned or sold off, their owners moving away in search of a new beginning. Schools, once the center of small communities, shut their doors as student numbers dwindled. Churches, where the echoes of psalms had once filled the air, were left locked and forgotten. Roads that had once carried wagons and horseback riders became overgrown with weeds, swallowed by the land they had once conquered. What had taken generations to build was now dismantled in a matter of decades, erased not by war, but by the relentless march of time and progress. By the turn of the 21st century, what remained of these settlements were only shadows, faint traces of history barely visible on old maps. Some ruins still stood, weathered by sun and rain, their crumbling walls silent witnesses to a past few remembered. Others had disappeared entirely, reclaimed by nature, their names known only to history books and the occasional traveler who stumbled upon their remains. The wind, which once carried the voices of farmers and settlers, now whispered through empty fields and broken fences, telling stories of a people who had once dreamed of carving out an eternal place in Africa only to fade into its vast and yielding landscape. In the dead of night, the ruins speak. The wind whistles through the skeletal remains of old houses, slipping through the cracks of rotting doorframes and rattling the rusted hinges of forgotten barns. Dust swirls in the moonlight, carrying with it the ghosts of those long gone. Some say the spirits of the settlers still wander here, their presence felt in the shifting shadows of broken walls and the eerie silence that settles over these abandoned streets. Where children once played and families gathered for Sunday prayers, only the whisper of the wind remains. The descendants of these pioneers, those who left for the cities in search of a different life, return only to find silence where laughter once lived. Their childhood homes are now crumbling relics of a world that no longer exists. Yet, not all have left. A few Boer families remain, scattered among the ruins, stubbornly clinging to the land their ancestors bled for. They live in defiance of time, tending to empty farms, repairing fences that no longer need mending, and keeping alive the traditions that once defined their people. But their numbers are dwindling. The churches still stand, but their bells no longer toll. The schoolhouses remain, but their classrooms are silent. The markets, once filled with the sound of bartering and the scent of fresh produce, are nothing more than vacant stalls collecting dust. Each year, another home is abandoned, another family packs their belongings and leaves, and another piece of history fades into the earth. Tourists and historians occasionally stumble upon these settlements, drawn by curiosity or the allure of forgotten history. They take photographs of the crumbling homesteads, run their fingers along the weathered stone of old churches, and document the remains of what was once a thriving frontier. Some write about the lost world of the Afrikaner pioneers, turning their struggles into academic studies or fleeting articles. But for those who once called these places home, the pain is not an abstract curiosity, it is a wound that never truly heals. The stories of survival, of battle, of triumph and loss, are now little more than echoes in a land that no longer carries their mark. A culture that once saw itself as the master of the land now finds itself fading into obscurity. The grand dreams of the pioneers, the belief that they could carve a nation from the wilderness, have been swallowed by time. The settlements that once stood as monuments to resilience and faith are now forgotten names on maps, their foundations buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. As the modern world moves forward, these towns remain frozen in the past, preserved only in the memories of the last few who refuse to forget. But the question lingers: how long before even those memories are lost, leaving nothing but the wind to tell the tale of a people who once dared to call this place home? Time does not preserve. Time erases. What was once built with sweat and stone is now crumbling beneath the weight of years. The land that was painstakingly tamed by ox-drawn plows and the calloused hands of settlers slowly returns to its natural state. Trees rise where houses once stood, their roots breaking through the remains of long-forgotten floors. Rivers, once diverted for irrigation, reclaim their original paths, swallowing roads that had once connected these lost towns to the outside world. Veldt grass stretches across empty fields, creeping over what remains of fences, burying churchyards beneath a sea of green. In the end, nature does what time commands it forgets. Perhaps it is fitting. The land was never truly conquered, only borrowed for a time. The Boers, who once saw themselves as the rightful rulers of this harsh and untamed world, are now little more than whispers on the wind. The settlements they built, the sacrifices they made, the wars they fought all have faded into the backdrop of history, dissolving like mist under the morning sun. The great frontier they sought to carve into permanence has turned against them, swallowing the last remnants of their defiance. Now, where towns once stood, only silence remains, a quiet testament to the impermanence of human ambition. And yet, their history is not entirely lost. Some stories resist erasure. In a dusty attic, an old diary filled with faded ink still carries the voice of a settler who once called this place home. In a forgotten box, a photograph captures a moment of joy from a time long past, preserving a face no one remembers. A grandchild, raised far from the lands of their ancestors, may still hold a vague, half-formed memory of a place once spoken of in hushed reverence. The ruins of a farmhouse, its walls barely standing, may still offer shelter to those willing to listen to the echoes of the past. History is fragile, but it does not vanish completely. It lingers in fragments, waiting for someone to find it. Their towns may be gone, but their ghosts will walk forever. The wind that howls through the ruins carries their voices, the trees that grow in their absence stand as silent witnesses to their struggles, and the land that once bore their footsteps still remembers. Though the world may forget, the soil beneath the ruins knows their story. And perhaps that is the truest form of remembrance, not in books or monuments, but in the earth itself, which holds their past even as it reclaims what was once theirs. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.